In this video, we want to talk about brazing and along with some tubing bending as well. So before we heat the joint, it's always good practice to introduce nitrogen into a system to purge the air and reduce the possibility of oxidization to a minimum. A pressure of 1 to 2 psi is enough to purge the piping. In other words, run nitrogen through the system. Apply heat to the parts to be joined with an acetylene or oxyacetylene torch. Heat the tube first, beginning about 1 inch from the edge of the fitting, sweeping the flame around the tube. Okay, so this is just an example of applying the heat. You want this little blue part of the flame, that little blue cone, to be right on the tube or as close to it as possible. As you do this, you're going to go around the tube from one side to another. Heat uniformly, sweeping the flame from the fitting to the tube. Apply the filter rod or wire at the point where the tube enters the socket. In other words, right there, because you want to use the heat from the flame to pull that molten metal up into the socket and the connection by capillary attraction. When the proper temperature is reached, the filler metal will flow readily by capillary attraction into the space between the tube and fitting. Okay, so again, just be patient. Get that tube nice and hot all the way around, and then the metal will pull towards the flame. And you can see it doing it in this one. The temperature of which the metal at the joint should be hot enough to melt the filler metal. When the joint is at the correct temperature, it will be cherry red in color. Several choices of high temperature brazing material are available. Some include a high silver content, 46% silver, and must always be used with a flux. Some high temperature brazing materials have been developed that they do not have a high silver content, 15% silver. They may not require flux when making copper to copper connections. Only soft tubing should be bent. Special bending tools are not needed for smaller sizes used in domestic appliances. However, a much neater and more satisfactory job is possible with such tools. You can bend pipe with hand, but you got to be very careful to make sure it doesn't kink. Tubing should be bent so that it doesn't place any strain on the fittings after it is installed. Be careful when bending tubing to keep it round. Do not allow the tubing to kink, flatten, or buckle. This is an example of what not to do. It's very easy to do when you're hand bending tubing. Tubes should be bent slowly and carefully. It is always wise to use as large of a radius as possible. This reduces the amount of flattening. It's also easier to bend a large radius. Don't try to make complete bend in one operation. Bend the tubing gradually. An inexpensive tool called a bending spring may be used. They're available in a variety of sizes and can be used both inside and outside the tubing. Bending springs can be used internally for making bends near the end of a tubing. An internal bending spring for 1/2 inch OD tubing may be used as an external bending spring for 1/4 inch OD tubing. In other words, one tool can be used in multiple places. This is just an example of bending springs. Bending springs tend to bend on the tubing after the bend. The spring bender can be easily removed by twisting the spring. This changes the spring diameter slightly so the grip on the tubing is released. Okay, and again, just an example of using a tubing bender or spring type. If a bend is to be made near a flare, an external spring is used. Bend the tube before making this flare. An internal spring can be used either before or after the flaring operation. The triple size tubing bender is used for many types of soft tubing. The calibrated markings allow the technician to make accurate left and right and offset bends. This is an example of the triple bender. Making accurate 90-degree bends, measure from one end of the tube, place a mark on the tube. Okay, so mark where you want your bend. Position the tube in the bender. The end measured is left of the tube clamping hook. The measured mark should be directly under the L marking of the form lever faceplate. Okay, so again, the mark is lined up with the L. That's where your that's where the center of your bend is going to be. With a steady motion, pull the form lever downward until the 0 mark on the form lever directly opposite the 90-degree mark on the form wheel. Okay, this is just an example of that. That tells you you have a 90-degree bend. If you were just doing a 45-degree bend, you'd put it where the 45 is. The 0 mark would match with the 45. And that's all there is about tubing and brazing. Just a matter of practice.